So, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Peter Robbins, investigative writer, specializing in the subject of UFOs.
All right, and you have written how many books now?
Well, I would say 1.5 books, but certainly some hundreds of papers, articles, columns, commentaries, criticisms, monographs, etc. And probably have another book or two on the bookshelves this time next year.
Really?
Yes. One almost done and one in the process, but last book published online, as you know, just a few weeks ago.
And the first one was Left at Eastgate.
Yeah, which came out here in the States in the spring of 1997 and in the United Kingdom in June of 97, and very proud to say it went on to become a smash bestseller there.
Okay, and the newest one is kind of a follow-up in a way.
Yeah, that's right, Soraya. It's called Deliberate Deception, a case of disinformation in the UFO research community. And it addresses inaccuracies, conscious inaccuracies, peppered through a new book on the Rendlesham Forest incident, which of course Larry Warren and I, Larry being one of the eyewitnesses, and my co-author on Left at Eastgate, wrote about back in the day. And I felt that they were so egregious and so methodically aimed at undercutting his credibility as a witness and my veracity as an investigative writer, that I felt it really warranted the treatment that I gave it. So we have a new 450-page book out. I should also say that I felt I did not want anybody, even for a moment, to feel that I had done it out of jealousy or in any small-minded spirit. And so I thought the right way to go was literally to give it away. So I am not charging for it. And it was published online by my friends in England who publish a great magazine that you and all of your listeners might want to subscribe to. Also free. It's a monthly that comes out of Manchester called Phenomena magazine, covering the entire paranormal beat in the UK. And they published it as a special report. The written part is fairly modest in length, but it has hundreds of pages in terms of a series of appendices that now form the largest database on the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident of 1980 ever made public, and I'm very proud of that.
Wow. Okay, and how long is the written part of it?
Well, it's out in a format of like English typewriter pages, single-spaced and larger than our typewriter pages. If this were published as a book, the text part would probably come in only 75 or 80 pages tops.
Okay.
So it's a fairly modest book to read.
Yeah, and you've taken issue with one of the things that they talk about is Larry not being there during the whole Rendlesham Forest. And so you want to talk a little bit about that?
I'm sure I'd be glad to. That has been so discredited now, literally for decades, because we've presented his military paperwork and have witnesses that put him on location. And we see by his paperwork, he first went on post in on-the-job training as a security police officer, I think within a few days of when John Lennon was shot at the beginning of December 1980, and the event did not happen till the end of the month. So for anyone still pounding away at that, I don't even have the time of day for them. It's complete nonsense.
And why would they suggest he wasn't there?
Larry was the whistleblower. He was the first person to come forward in public under his own name and tell his story. He also was the first person to make contact of any of the authentic eyewitnesses to any parts of the 3 nights of the events in question, to find a respected UFO researcher. In Larry's case, it was a man named Larry Fawcett. And we're going back to 1982 here, Soraya. Larry Fawcett at the time was not just a well-known UFO investigator, He was a police lieutenant in the Coventry, Connecticut Police Department, and certainly had good interview techniques and knew how to handle himself professionally. And over a period of time, Larry Warren laid out all of the specifics, not just of his own involvement, but what he had understood, what had been shared with him, what he had learned, what he knew about the other events and about the other men involved in the other events. Larry Fawcett then took this material, put it together in the form of a Freedom of Information Act action, and some months later it resulted in a very positive outcome, the release of a single-page document, now known in UFO circles as the HALT document or the HALT memo. It is a memorandum that Colonel Halt, the deputy base commander, lieutenant colonel at the time, of RAF Bentwaters, the base where the men involved were stationed, wrote, I believe as a courtesy to the Ministry of Defense, and even though it takes 3 nights and compresses them into 2, it minimizes a great deal of the action, it leaves out a great deal, and it redacts certain things. It is an official memorandum of record that the event actually happened, on Air Force letterhead, of course, signed by a United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Now, it was sent to the United Kingdom to Jenny Randles, a well-known UFO researcher, and ultimately it was the document that blew the case open in early October of 1983 in, at the time, the world's largest tabloid newspaper, the News of the World. Now, back to your question, when Larry Warren gave this information to Larry Fawcett, it was certainly not after getting permission from the men who he named. He just did it. He, in common today parlance, he outed them. And starting with the colonel, I think there was a certain amount of animus, resentment, and the fact that other men in that circle of men with him on the third night, I know a number of them, I've spoken with them. Anybody who has followed the Rendlesham story has seen how Larry has been treated by the media, by the skeptics and the debunkers, and unfortunately by members of the UFO research community. And Larry Warren is an in-your-face kind of guy. He is incredibly principled. He has never backed down from this. He has stood his ground for, gosh, like 32 years now. I've never known anybody with that kind of emotional stamina. He is a true hero. And he is not a kind of person who is concerned with, being nicey-nicey with people to get them to like him. He simply tells the truth as he knows it, and if you don't like it, that's the way it is. And that heat is still coming at him. I feel that the new book is beginning to change that. And by that I mean my new book, not the new book that was officially published this spring, Encounter in the Rendlesham Forest. I'm talking about the book Deliberate Deception, a case of disinformation in the UFO research community.
Now, in the book, you also mentioned that you feel that Roswell was more important than Rendlesham.
I realize after the fact, I may have selected my words in a way that wasn't clear in that one instance. The question, a statement that's just now become sort of cavalier, is Rendlesham is more important than Roswell. Well, you're comparing apples and oranges here. I am, it's just a fact. I'm one of the most involved investigative writers in this particular case, being Rendlesham. I've been working it for more than 25 years and obsessively for almost 10 years to get the book out, but I've kept up and continued my work ever since. In fact, I was back there not 2 weeks ago. The bottom line here is that Roswell happened in late June or early July of 1947. And literally all of the witnesses are gone now. The paper trail has been explored to the greatest degree possible, although there's always going to be last pieces of popcorn popping forever on certain things. There have been ever so many books written about it, from absolutely airheaded to extraordinarily accurate and scholarly. I think one of the finest books ever written on the subject, well, Stanton Friedman's MJ12, what's it, Top Secret Magic, and The Corona Crash are among the very best. But Don Schmitt and Tom Carey's Witness to Roswell is a book that should be in every UFO library. Don and Tom went back to Roswell repeatedly and interviewed everyone that was still alive, all of the children of the people that were involved who had an awareness or contact or were threatened on their lives. Many of these people over the years did not know each other or know each other's accounts. They brought them together brilliantly. However, with Rendlesham, we have a case that happened in a decidedly military context that has now brought forth quite an impressive amount of documentation, military and otherwise, much of which you can read and look for yourself at in Deliberate Deception. Literally all of the witnesses, with a few exceptions, are alive. Many of them have gone on record to some degree, many have not. If our Senate, if our Congress ever had the courage to address the issue of UFOs, this would be the case that could break it wide open. And these people could be subpoenaed to present, evidence that they would be compelled to give, I believe. So, in that sense, Roswell isn't a place by itself. It is the one that got it all started. It is the seminal case, and when you talk to people who have no interest in UFOs, everybody knows the word Roswell like they know the word Brooklyn, like they know the Eiffel Tower and the Empire State Building. It is a worldwide known brand. But I believe, that aside, that Rendlesham is the best one that we have to work with now contemporaneously.
Well, I think also the difference with Roswell versus Rendlesham is nobody is going to argue that nothing happened at Rendlesham. Whereas there's at least the argument that what happened at Roswell was not UFO related. Rendlesham was UFO related. You don't get a lot of people saying it wasn't.
Actually, as a super specialist in the case, I can turn you on to a lot of people who have published around the idea that it's just the opposite. In
Really?
fact, the list of absolute nonsense and crapola that has been put forward to justify a truly anomalous answer.
Well, like the lighthouse explanation. But I mean like from more credible people have presented that Roswell may not have been a UFO crash.
Well, of all of the people that have tried to make a case or have attempted to make cases that Roswell was not truly anomalous, among the best of them is my dear friend and close colleague Nick Redfern, who some years back, when I was still working, as I did for a number of years as a consultant to the city of Roswell and helped to organize their yearly conferences and festivals, we brought Nick in as a speaker, and I thought, he had amazing chutzpah, as we say in Yiddish, to present it at a Roswell conference, that it was this advanced piece of German technology and the beings in it were not of this earth, but suffered from a very rare disease that left you your body very emaciated, your skull relatively large, eyes large, and Nick laid it out quite well. I think in part because I worked for the city for several years, and in that time, especially then, made good friends with some of the key researchers, local ones whose names are not huge, and also got into deeper relationships with people like Don Schmitt and Tom Carey, and of course Stan Friedman, who is now, I guess, the preeminent ufologist in the world, and the man who really cracked it open in 1980 by finding Jesse Marcel Sr. and getting him to go on record for the first time. Marcel Sr., for the people who are watching, was, at the time of the events, at the Roswell Army Airfield. And let's remember that we're talking about something that was a small town in 1947. It's now a town, a city of about 53,000. But the Roswell Army Airfield, the home of the 509th Bomber Wing, was the first nuclear strike force in the world. And please don't think that's coincidental. I am convinced that the interest of these other intelligences, however you want to characterize them, in Roswell had to do with the nuclear presence there. Anyway, Marcel was the first Army officer, along with one other, to be brought out to the debris field by the ranch foreman who found the original crash debris. And he was castigated, made fun of, humiliated. It hurt him for the rest of his life. His son, who was about, I don't know, I'm trying to remember how old Jesse Jr. was at the time, somewhere between 8 and 11, let's say. His father woke him up and brought him down to the kitchen where he had a cardboard box with fragments that he had just brought in from the field. And of course, that memory was key to Jesse, who went on to have a very distinguished career as an Air Force flight surgeon, as a physician in rural Montana, lived in Helena. One of the kindest, most honest, most decent people I ever met in my life. Very proud to have called him a friend. And we lost him last summer in his early 70s, much too young. Again, Roswell, Rendlesham, apples, oranges. An unassailable, historic case that kicked everything off to a great degree. Rendlesham, the best one we have to work with now, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and also the witnesses, as you just said, the first witness to go on record was 1980 for Roswell, and it was 53 years? Or no, 53 years.
No.
33 years.
Yeah.
33 years earlier, as opposed to Rendlesham, which was just a few years earlier.
Yeah, I think, just to cut in for a moment, we're dealing with that generation that Tom Brokaw very appropriately coined the greatest generation. These men who fought in World War II, who were involved with the 509th, who were stationed there at the time, who were involved all the way up the chain of command, they took their service, their security oaths very seriously. And some of the most extraordinary testimony we have on Roswell are deathbed testimonies, and testimonies from men who decided after, I've met several of them who literally said to me, you know, I'm 84, I'm 86 years old, I was never going to talk about it, but I was watching a documentary on the History Channel, and I saw one of the guys I knew from back then doing just that, and I thought, you know what, I'd like to be on record with this before I die. Larry Warren, as I discussed in Deliberate Deception, another thing that has created tremendous animus on the parts of some of the other witnesses who I believe in great part have been nurtured to not trust him, not like him, not take his account seriously, when if they just look at the evidence, it's overwhelming. The physical evidence that is site-specific to where Larry's event took place is the best physical evidence in the entire case. Again, in the words of the great Stanton Friedman, don't bother me with the facts, my mind is already made up. And that's the way a lot of these hard heads are about it. But again, the evidence is there. Larry's sin was that he broke Air Force regulations. He didn't follow orders. He was told to shut up about it, and he wouldn't. He was told not to look into it, and he did. He was told certainly not to talk to anybody else about it. The first person he spoke to was in a long-distance call the morning after the third night to his mother in upstate New York, and that call was cut off, and we discussed that at length and left at East Gate. He did not play the game the way that you're supposed to if you are in the military. And for that, there are people who will never forgive him and who will always try to bring him down. The other aspect, Soraya, is it was the information Larry made public.
and not just about the UFO incident, but about the fact, very embarrassing to both Her Majesty's government and the United States government, that although our treaty with the United Kingdom at the time of these events did not allow the U.S. to have nuclear ordnance in the U.K., we had a huge amount of nuclear ordnance on that complex. I've been in the weapons storage area now. Of course, it's all abandoned. That base is, well, it's all closed down. That base is in private hands now. It was decommissioned in the 90s. But that was something also that he is not forgiven about, and that the authors of the new book, Pope, Peniston, and Burroughs, who do still take their security oaths as lifelong and binding, will not comment on. They cannot. It should also be noted that when Larry Warren was in basic training, he was trained for two specialty fields. One was anti-terrorism, and the other was to be a security police officer working around nuclear ordnance, which he did.
So, jumping back to Roswell for
Yeah,
a moment,
sure.
one of the things Nick Redfern had mentioned is that being such an old case, whenever people look for documentation, so on and so forth, it's very possible that none of it actually exists. Not necessarily that they were hiding anything, but just because it's so old, that they weren't kept on computers, they weren't necessarily filed the way we file things now, and it's possible that when the Air Force goes looking, they don't really find anything, and they don't themselves know at this point what really happened.
Yeah, there's some truth to that for sure. However, I think there's at least as much truth in the likelihood that these things are still considered so highly classified
Sure.
that they will never see the light of day. Let's imagine for a moment that, the current or the next president of the United States working in concert with other world leaders next week, next month, 5 years from now, goes forward and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my solemn duty to inform you that since the summer of 1947 we have been aware of blah, blah, blah." It's not as simple as it seems. In doing so, certainly for a president of the United States, one would be saying, in effect, every one of my predecessors, to one degree or another, was, or may well have been an unindicted co-conspirator in the biggest cover-up in the history of humanity. And that cuts across every political belief, party membership, or extreme to the left or the right. And nobody wants to get caught in that, storm.
Sure. And that was Nick Redfern I was referring
Oh,
to.
yeah, no, I understood.
And not Nick Pope.
Yeah, no, I understood.
The other thing Nick mentioned when I was talking to him recently, his latest book on UFO deaths talks about the case of, is it Betty Cash?
Cash Landrum, yeah.
Yeah, and how the object they saw was right after Rendlesham, and it looks similar to the descriptions of the object at Rendlesham.
Not to the one that was on the ground on the third night with Larry. By some descriptions, it bears some similarity, and I'll leave that to Peniston and Burroughs, of what they saw on the first night. The fact is, yes, in the Cash Landrum incident, where, and this is, how can I say, this was in Texas, literally superimposed on the time of the 3 nights of what was going on in Suffolk, England, but it was an unknown craft being escorted, but as I recall, 24 black helicopters or something.
Something like that.
And it was observed by these 2 regular, very nice, local
I think
rural
there were
women.
3.
Well, the grandson of one of them was with them. And did both of them, or all 3 of them, develop cancer not long after?
I think just the one. Betty
Cash.
Cash.
Yeah.
But she's the one that got out of the car and approached it.
Yes. So I think, once again, we're talking about 2 entirely different events and 2 entirely different phenomena. But I think, we are creatures that respond to numbers.
We love to see synchronicities and coincidences. And again, I may be completely off base here. But I think if two major events happen within the same 24-hour period, and there are even some superficial similarities, even if they were simply dealing with unknown objects, but they happen, within that proximity 4,000 miles apart at about the same time, there would be a tendency among some people to immediately put them together as part of, a similar phenomena or a similar dynamic, however you want to see it. Yeah.
Okay, I just found it interesting. I didn't realize they pretty much overlapped. When I read that, I was
Absolutely.
like, that is kind of interesting.
It is.
I mean, at the same time, but it's still, you never know.
I was born on Lyndon Johnson's birthday.
To me, it seemed like the cache incident was more likely a military craft that wasn't functioning properly.
That was my best educated guess. Again, as you know, I'm very, very careful when I talk or write about this phenomena to parse what I absolutely know to be empirically true and can prove to what I am convinced is true but cannot offer hard evidence on, to what I think is true, to what I fear is true, to etc. I compartmentalize in that sense.
Right.
And a number of my colleagues don't, and that's sometimes not a good thing.
No, because you get people speaking as if something's a fact when it's their opinion, and then it muddies the waters. So, as you started, this whole new book started when you reviewed Nick Pope's latest book.
Yes, it did. And in fact, as I start the book, for me it was like falling into a short story by Franz Kafka. A writer is asked to review a book for a respected publication that they work for. In part, they're chosen because they're familiar with the subject. They've written a book on it themselves. They do have a somewhat aggressive or adversarial relationship with two of the authors. The lead author, however, is a good friend and a close colleague. But as the writer begins to read the book they're reviewing and make their notes, they start to see, as clear as little bright stars, data points of information that could only, and I have to stress here, only, have been taken from the book that they and their co-author had written, and either distorted, presented in a manner that is twisted to turn it back on itself, so as to suggest that what is established in their book is actually untrue or suspect, and that the real evidence to back it up is consciously being withheld. I can only say, for people that are scratching their head and wondering, what did he exactly mean by that? That's one of the reasons why I'm not charging you for the new book. Please read it and decide for yourself.
It's almost a very subtle attack on you, Larry Warren, and your work. But if someone doesn't know about your work, they would never realize there was an attack going on.
Exactly.
Because they do it by stating things factually. Oh, this is, for instance, saying this is the first book written by one of the actual witnesses, when Larry was the first one to have
beat him by 17 years.
Yeah.
There also the fact that the lead author is a respected individual in the field, and we, the readers, have no choice but to take their word for it. And this is an author of 4 previous books who is known worldwide and to a great degree respected. But there is not a footnote, there is not an annotation, there is not a reading list or a bibliography. The index is missing some very key additions. One of the ironies of the book, as you'll find out as you come into the end, is the most often used reference book in their book is our book, which is credited once begrudgingly because there was no choice, because our book was referred to by a former Chief of Staff of the Ministry of Defense when he was a member of Parliament, arguing about points in our book with the then Secretary for Defense in 1997, and so the name of our book appears in Hansard's, which is the equivalent of our daily congressional record. Otherwise, our book is the source that is most drawn from of print sources, and if that's not true, I would like to be corrected in person by the lead author. And the witness who is never credited, whose work is referred to the most, is my co-author Larry Warren.
Who they meanwhile say wasn't there.
Well, yeah. And in fact, the evidence in Larry's support of testimony of other men who were there, the physical evidence, the documentary evidence in terms of parts of his service record that we have and include that are not questioned, even by Colonel Halt, as far as their authenticity goes, it's like a funhouse mirror. And after 32 years, to try to come down and discredit this guy directly by innuendo, by suggestion, by presenting an idea, but even though the facts are available to you, to exclude them, to consciously try to shape the opinion of the reader in a way that is completely unethical, is what compelled me to write my book. I've had it with this. I have absolutely had it. I have stood by this guy's side for 25 plus years on this, but the first few years, I mean, his offer to me when he invited me to co-write this book with him was not prove me right. It was prove me wrong. Trip me up. Do everything you can to establish that I'm a liar, or a wannabe, or a mental case, or a Manchurian candidate, or whatever. If you can do it, and publish it. Granted, it'll be something of a schizophrenic book, but it'll go where it goes. However, if you can't disprove my claims, then help me back them up. I worked for several years to try to trip him up. I write about it at length, and I give examples. You know why? Not because I'm some altruist or, my reputation as an investigative writer, he's not an investigative writer, he's a regular guy trying to figure out what the hell happened to him. But my reputation as a writer was going to either rise or fall on my making the right decisions and presenting evidence in his case. And I did. And it's one of the reasons the book became the bestseller that it was, and that we've engendered tremendous respect from readers, colleagues, research specialists, military and intelligence people, retired and serving, all over the world. As far as I'm concerned, a part of this new book, Encounter in Rendlesham, is an attempt by these two guys who were involved on the first night, were completely traumatized by a very real event that totally changed their lives, like Larry's event and the aftermath changed his, and none of them have ever been the same since, and not for the better. But that when they approached the lead writer to invite him to work the book with them, and there was certainly no question that they were looking for a co-author, they're not writers, certainly not trained, that he took the opportunity to create this extraordinarily powerful disinformation thread. And it is elegant, and it is professional, and it is brilliantly realized. And it's one of the reasons why I have to be so specific and analytical in our book. And to anticipate one question that you might ask me, but if not, it's one I'd like to be on the record, is why would he do something like that? In 1997, when our book was published in the United Kingdom, it came out in June, which was the exact same month that Nick Pope's first book came out in the UK. Ours came out with a very small publisher and a modest promotional budget. Nick's was a huge book with Simon & Schuster with a very ample budget. You couldn't go into a London tube station without seeing posters for it, or every couple of big red double-decker buses that would roll by would have a huge broadside on it. he and I and Larry were doing an awful lot of press, television, BBC World Service, and radio interviews. And Nick, who was an employee of the Ministry of Defense at that time, and certainly up until the last few years, went out of his way to help us have this become a bestseller. And you'll see the ways when you read my book. And I am eternally thankful to him for it. Why did he do it? Because he believed in our book. He knew it was important. He knew it was a valuable and powerful book that could help people understand how serious and real this event was. In fact, even months later, of his own volition, without even asking, it was a wonderful surprise, he wrote a review, a very positive review of our book for the Ministry of Defense's own in-house monthly magazine called Focus. 58,000 circulation at the time went out to every mover and shaker in the ministry, in the military-industrial complex, shall we say, cabinet-level people, to movers and shakers in America, many people in the Pentagon, and military people around the world. Can you imagine how few times the Ministry of Defense's monthly magazine has reviewed a UFO book? Very, very few. And I think what happened as time continued to pass, Nick being a very loyal civil servant to Her Majesty's government, it began to catch up with him. And I'm being just purely theoretical here, and he'll never tell me the truth, that his assistance to us, because he believed in it, in that summer, again, both of these books came out the summer of the 50th anniversary of Kenneth Arnold, and the Cascade Mountain sightings about a week and a half before Roswell, and the whole 50th anniversary of the modern age of UFO sightings. It was an extraordinary summer, both here and in the UK, with new publications, UFO documentaries all over TV, new books, and a kind of opening for a moment in time. It seems to go in sort of a wave form. Mm-hmm. The media, the public, governments being a bit more open to it and then sort of closing down again, like a flower closing at night, as some do. And I genuinely feel that as the years passed, he regretted that decision. Even though we had a very real friendship and a close colleagueship, when the opportunity presented itself many years later, he decided to act on it. And in an ironic way, as such, I can't take it personal, because I don't think it was personal. As they say in the mafia, before the hitmen give you 2 in the back of the head, nothing personal, it's just business. And by example, let me say that that same month of that same summer, in June of 1997, the United States Printing Office came out with a book about that thick, a United States Air Force publication called Roswell, Case Closed. It was, 400, 350, maybe 500 pages. It was huge. You could use it as a doorstop of total and unadulterated crap. The crash test dummies from 1952. They trotted out every piece of nonsense possible to discredit Roswell. Why do I bring that up here? Because half a century after the case that kicked it all off, these people are like elephants. They never forget, and they're going to always keep coming back. In a way, it's a red badge of courage, that they feel the need, the compulsion to attack the best research, the best findings, the most credible investigators, the best documented publications. It is an ongoing process. So am I thrown that this was tried on us 34 years after the event, 17 years after our book was first published, 8 years after it was republished in an expanded edition? No, it doesn't surprise me at all. And that is the way that I see it. Again, when we finished writing Left at East Gate and people, got snarky or slagged us off, we could say, read our book, as nonfiction authors can do. We did this. And you'd always get somebody coming back, I don't have the money for your book. It's like, I'm going to give you a copy. Order one at your library. Kick in with a couple of people and buy one. And And I just didn't even want to deal with that this time. Now, that's my idealism and not my practicality. In practical terms, it was the damn stupidest thing I've done in a while. I make a very modest living doing this, and I have bills to pay too. But the fact was that 5 months, almost 5 months of work, and probably 700 focused, dedicated hours, most of which was spent right here in this office, just outside of Ithaca, New York. I know it was the right thing to do. And I believe in karma. These things come back to us in good ways. At some point in the future, it's not out of the question that I might publish it as a book, but I have already destroyed the great majority of book sales, putting it out for free in full color. And that's fine. That's the way it should be.
Okay. And also, when you bring up Roswell, too, even though it's so many years between the event, was there much knowledge of Roswell between 1947 and 1980 in the UFO community? Or was it just kind of in the background and then it came out?
Soraya, it literally wasn't even in the background.
Okay.
It began to blow open in 1980, and in fact, you can go to a book on the bottom shelf behind you there, The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and
Yes. Okay.
a very well-known former intelligence operative, which was the first actual book on Roswell. It really didn't blow open until 1980, ironically, the year of the Rendlesham Forest incident. But, maybe there was the people that had lived through it, the people who lived in that town, who were threatened to be murdered. Their bodies left out in the desert. 12-year-old children who were told that if they ever talked about what they heard Mommy and Daddy talk about, that their whole family would be killed, and told by a group of guys who I think were very carefully selected for this very nasty job, young Army, Air Force, military, police officers, all at least 6 feet tall, who must have been briefed when they made these threats to do it in a non-threatening manner. Because again, you read Schmidt and Carey's Witness to Roswell. I have to be a skeptic in this, which means to me, just because I no longer have what I'll call the luxury of disbelief, I have to be all the more careful in every new investigation I get involved in. And when I say investigation, that could constitute something like writing Left at East Gate with Larry, which took 9 years, working side by side with Bud Hopkins for 6 years throughout the so-called Brooklyn Bridge UFO abduction case, or sitting down with somebody who is very, very in earnest about wanting to share something with me at a quiet moment at a break in a UFO conference, and making the same kind of judgments to a degree about character, honesty, ethics, sanity, that somebody investigating a felony would have to make, or a psychologist or a psychiatrist assessing the presenting story of somebody who may have much more deep trauma hidden from it. And as a result, I am very circumspect in this. And when I started, and then this is a very important digression, I think, because it is such an outstanding book, and it is such a fine piece of investigative research. These two guys, they just added a tremendous thing to the literature, and there's so much good, bad, and indifferent literature on Roswell out there over the decades. But you read an account of somebody who was 12 years old at the time and overheard their parent, or somebody who was 84 years old and, was involved on some level, was the town mortician, and, they get a call from the base ordering several child-sized caskets, and they know it's a small town, no children have died, or the local sheriff, or the ranch foreman, or family members, and after dozens and dozens and dozens of them, bearing in mind that nobody was looking for fame, nobody was looking to get paid, nobody wanted to be on the Oprah show, nobody wanted to write a book, they just wanted to get this stuff off their chest before they died and be on record with someone. That, for me, is the basis of compelling first-hand testimony.
Now, isn't it also possible if they had done some kind of military test or something, they might also threaten people to keep quiet?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's just what comes to mind when you mention that.
You're absolutely right. And in that sense, let's also remember, and for me this is a favorite fact about the dawn of the age of UFOs. By the summer of 1947, the Soviets were consolidating their holdings that they had grabbed up at the end of the war. And the West, the United States, the former Allied nations, were more and more concerned about Stalin's longing for expansion, the building of the Soviet army, the fact that they wanted to be a world power. Would they get the secret to the bomb, which of course they were working very hard to, and they did through a leak, a traitor, let's call names what they are here, who gave them the necessary information to create their first nuke by 49, as I recall. Most American historians date the actual origin from what we'll officially call the Cold War to July of 1947. Why? Because the Standard in, let's call it, the Foreign Service Industry, which is a monthly publication that's been around, I don't even know how long it's been published, called Foreign Affairs, certainly still a very distinguished monthly. That month, in July of 47, there was an article by an unknown young political scientist named George Kennan, who went on to live to be to be over 100 years old, was a advisor to, I believe, 9 or 10 United States presidents, and went on to become one of the most important political thinkers of 2 centuries. Kennan wrote an article under the pseudonym of X, and he titled it On Containment. And in it he laid out an idea to short-circuit another shooting war, World War III, between the West and the Soviets. And it was the idea of containing the Soviets to the countries they had expanded into already, including Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., behind, let's call it, an iron curtain. And so the war would be a standoff. It wouldn't be a hot war, shooting war. It would be a Cold War. The term Cold War emerged the month of the Roswell crash and the modern age of UFOs. They began at the same moment in time. Some people will look for meaning in that. I think it's random chance to a degree. And I also feel that over the next 45 years or so, 45 years short year, as the Soviet Union, until the Soviet Union disintegrated between 89 and 91, that for the next 45 years that was the policy that determined the West's response to the Soviet presence. Also, it was the Cold War, I think, moments in the Cold War and concerns that were publicly expressed that were used in some ways to cover aspects of the UFO story, and vice versa. That, famous UFO sighting could be interpreted as the test of a Soviet, a new weapon, and let's all get scared about that. So it was brilliant, besides what they called MAD, mutually assured destruction. We got our nukes, you got your nukes, but between us, we're never going to hit them. We're never going to shoot them at you, and you'll never shoot yours at us, because then we're all dead. In that same sense, the UFO situation and the Cold War situation, I believe, and I think Rich Dolan would be authority on this as our historian of record, and with his 2 marvelous volumes on UFOs and the national security state, and a 3rd one in the works right now, that this was a brilliantly choreographed dance at times, where one thing obscured, confused, upfused the other, until the crash of the Cold War, and then strategies had to change a little.
All right, so we were in dealing with, as you've said a number of times, the Roswell was the beginning of the modern UFO era. But the Kenneth Arnold sightings happened before Roswell. We had Foo Fighters. We had other UFO sightings before that. We had you could even include the airship wave.
1897.
In the very late 1800s. And Roswell wasn't really brought into notoriety to 1980. So why is it that Roswell is pointed to as the beginning?
That's a great question, Soraya. I guess, number one, when I say Roswell kicked it off, I really mean to bracket the Kenneth Arnold sightings of a week and a half before. What had happened there, and it's worth a word, is Kenneth Arnold was a private businessman and a private pilot. And he was flying in the Cascade Mountain Range, and he saw 7, 9, however many craft moving at such a fast speed that he was able to calculate based on his knowledge of flight measurements, that they were moving at about 1,800 miles an hour or so, which was far beyond anything that we had or imagined at the time. And the reason that it broke there, rather than him just filing it as a personal memory, was a plane had gone down a day or two before, and the Civil Air National Guard were out looking for it. So there were reporters at the airport when he landed. He gave them the story. It went out on the wire services, and a week and a half later, the Roswell debris was recovered. The Foo Fighter phenomena of World War II, very important, was something that was shared mostly by the pilots that were involved in it, upper echelon officers that were aware of it. It got some coverage, but it never captured the public imagination. The so-called firefight of Los Angeles of February 1942, I don't know, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, where a unknown, and you look at the photographs of this thing, famous news photographs with huge Klieg lights on it, and you look at it, you soften your gaze ever so slightly, you see the disc shape.
Oh, yeah.
Like 1,800 rounds of artillery were fired on it, no hits, I think 3 deaths.
And as it's been pointed out, those lights are hitting an object. They stop on that object. They don't continue on into the sky.
Exactly. It was like a force field was repelling them, for lack of a more.
Well, there was a solid opaque object there. It wasn't, it wasn't like a shadow or something.
That's right.
Otherwise, the beams would have continued off on.
Exactly, and very important point to make. It was 100% solid. It was an isolated incident. We now know that it wasn't Japanese from records that we recovered. Right. Also, going back even further, I mean, again, the airship wave was seen as totally separate because it was pre-hard, technology, combustion engine stuff. And then, you could also argue that really famous Von Daniken or Sitchin type events going back into time immemorial.
Well, sure. But if we're talking about modern UFOs...
I think really the reason was because when that Roswell story broke, the public was listening. And newspapers went wild with it. And it captured the imagination superimposed on fear of this whole new threat. America had just made the world safe for democracy, and here's the Soviet Union rattling its sabers, threatening to bring us back into a state of war again. Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason was sociological, part of it was political, and part of it was the time was right, and the media was going nuts with the subject of flying saucers. That, I think, is why the quote-unquote modern age of UFOs, and again, that term UFOs still wasn't referred to for almost another 10 years. I think it kicked in 55 or 56. It was flying saucers, aerial, unidentified aerial discs, unidentified aerial phenomena, and the like. So I think that's basically the reason.
Okay, all right. Do you want to show people your book collection here a little?
Why not? Spin around, baby.
Anything you want to say about any of them in particular?
Well, I am a bibliophile. I grew up in a reading family where books were highly prized. I started building my library as a boy, and I take pride in having a world-class UFO research library, as well as a library on 20th century history, esoteric history, mysteries in history, things that have always interested me. Being trained as an artist, I love certain imagery. On the top shelf over there, for example, those 2 top shelves are a lot of rare paperback books, and if we were to take them down, half of them, when you looked at each cover, your jaw would drop. They're so lurid. And some of them are wonderful books. Some of them I have just because of the graphics on the cover.
in this day and age, when we have the internet and we're overwhelmed with the fact that you can just punch in, a statement or a name or a word, and bang, you're connected up with all the information in the world on it. So much of it is unvetted. So much of it cannot be backed up.
Sure.
And it's part of the reason why I think research is slipping to a certain amount. You superimpose on that the world of digital photography and the explosion in things like Photoshop, and that's just for lay people. I'm much more interested in the analysis of old film photographs of UFOs, because so much of the stuff that's presented to us online may or may not be authentic. And I encourage everyone...
so easy to fake.
It is. And it's one of the reasons why I encourage anyone with a passion for any research specialty, no matter how good they are in doing their research online, to build a library around the subject that they're really interested in pursuing. There's no substitute for it. Plus, for me, each book is a special thing. Many of them, like a photograph, you have an association with. And as a passionate supporter of authors, the fact that I'm one has not diminished the thrill I get from adding another signed or inscribed book to my library, and I have certainly several hundred signed and inscribed books here and in the other rooms of the house that are also filled with books. Also over here, you see notebooks. I began my research in the late 1970s, and a lot of those are filled with hand-filled notes, or working away on your old IBM Selectric typewriter, or Xerox copies of documents or other things. And I made my way into the digital age. My first computer, I don't even know if it had a brand name. It had a half-size LED readout screen. A friend of mine had given it to me out of, I think, sympathy, and I thought I was on the deck of the Starship Enterprise. I had entered, the 22nd century or something. Now it changed a bit, and I replaced both of my computers last week. But yeah, I think books are invaluable to scholars and researchers and investigators, and there is no substitute for them. And I'm proud of every new book that any friend of mine publishes.
And here's the other thing with books versus the internet. Laird Scranton found that when he wrote his book on Velikovsky, that he cited news articles on the internet. When the publisher went back to verify those links, the news articles were gone. Or they had changed addresses, and so on and so. And for an ebook, that's not a big deal. But for a published book, if that's your source, it makes it a lot harder, because he was using as sources breaking news articles that supported some of what Velikovsky said, and then the article's gone.
It's funny. Smaller bookstores are disappearing at the rate that passenger pigeons did 100 years ago. They're all but gone. They're being swallowed up or killed off by the big multinationals. You go to a Barnes & Noble or something, or you order from Amazon, amazing selection, millions of books. But in the old days, you could still find real treasures. And while you were saying that, I was thinking, I found this book probably 25 years ago. It's a one-of-a-kind, hand-bound book called A Study of Press Coverage of Unidentified Flying Objects. It was published in '66. It's essentially a PhD thesis by this guy who is totally forgotten. It's typewriter paged out. It's brilliantly researched. You can see my notes all over it. It was one of the most valuable books that I was able to find when I began to investigate the origins of the ridicule factor. And it cites so many sources, like you say, where the original newspapers, suffer from the slow fire of acid-rich paper. And those books are gone. Those newspaper articles are gone. And every once in a while you look up to, I'm very opinionated here, wrong. But again, it's part of the thrill of building a library.
Right.
And, developing a database that you can be assured of to a much greater degree than anything that you find online, or to a great degree that you find online.
Now, you said you're working on 2 books right now?
Yeah. One is a compilation of papers, columns, articles that I've written over the last 25 years and putting them, the best of them, into one volume with just, certain sharpening and polishing. The other is Larry and I have never been fully satisfied with the editions of Left at Eastgate that have come out. And publishing has changed so much in the years that what we're looking to do next year is to put out a fully redacted, updated edition of the book that will probably always be best known for, but instead of your traditional, 20 photographs in bad reproductions stuck in the middle of the book, and maybe half a dozen drawings throughout, have several hundred illustrations peppered throughout. One of the best examples I can give you is a book by a friend of mine, a great scholar named Dr. James DeMeo. For me, Jim is the go-to guy on Reich cloud busting. He's done more of it than anybody alive, often under contract. He's broken droughts around the world. And he did something that's very rare in the world of real scholarship. He took several established disciplines, the history of climate change in the world, the history of the development of the killing off, the death of, the suppression of goddess worship, and essentially worshiping the feminine spirit rather than one monotheistic and rather sometimes mean-spirited guy. And most interesting in terms of superimposition, as the climates dried up in what we now call the Middle East, and as monotheism displaced the sometimes more gentler aspects of goddess worship, murder of women and children, violent murder, went up statistically as the atmosphere dried up. And as formally, and I mean, it's a brilliant work of scholarship, and the book that he put it in is available. It's called Saharasia, a cross between the word Sahara and Asia. And he not only makes his points brilliantly and underscores them with totally unquestionable data, unquestioned data on this phenomena, or these phenomena, but he does it in a way that is so brilliantly laid out and so well illustrated throughout that it becomes an experience in itself reading the actual book. And for me, that is an advance. He's taken existing disciplines and he has built on them a new series of discoveries, which, formal historians, scientists, sociologists, antiquarian scholars pretty much ignore. In his own way, what he's done here is what people like John Anthony West and the radical Egyptologists started to do 25 years ago, and drove the official antiquarian offices in Egypt, as well as traditional Egyptologists, crazy. When it was established that the weathering, the disintegration on the outside of the Sphinx was moisture-driven.
Rain-driven.
Exactly. It has not rained like that probably in at least 8,000 years, which predates what we'll call Egypt per se, because the old kingdoms don't go back, it's still several thousand years unaccounted for there, which means that somebody was doing something before they were. And if you've got an investment in terms of national pride, in terms of tourism, in terms of the way that we like to see the safeness of history, then you've got a giant problem there. And it's a problem that people like you and I relish, because it indicates how little we know about the way things are.
It creates a mystery, a hole that needs to be filled.
It does. And for me, when I was probably in my teens, when I first heard of, the myth of Atlantis, I thought it was just that, something that Plato had,
Right.
But in fact, the idea of natural cataclysms that could have totally wiped out entire civilizations 30,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, or in some cases that some of these civilizations might have gotten to the point that we are in terms of weapons of extraordinary mass destruction, and set something in motion where that all but destroyed. And then, a huge series of earthquakes or other earth changes buried the last of it. And we dig this stuff up occasionally or find it on the bottom of an ocean,
Right.
or that wonderful city off Japan that
Yeah,
literally,
Yonaguni.
I love it. And you do the math on when was the last time that was above water? Maybe 30,000 years ago?
12. Last
Not
Ice
bad.
Age.
Very exciting stuff to me.
Yes.
And again, I think to a growing number of open-minded people, it's not something that's changing geometrically, but it's changing arithmetically every day. Same as UFO acceptance as a truly anomalous phenomena and its implications of other intelligences, that we're not only not alone, but we may be not alone surrounded by any number of different kinds of neighbors from any number of different locations, be it one dimension in the way, one dimension in the way, one
Away?
dimension away, in this room with us, sitting on their
Right.
invisible chairs enjoying our chat, or from the middle of the earth, or, Alpha Centauri, or where have you. A lot of people, that makes them nervous. It throws everything that they thought they know into potential chaos, so better to demonize people like us than to, have the courage to step out of what they think they know and educate themselves, or begin to look at the possibilities that exist outside of officialdom.
And we should also throw in not just other dimensions, but outside our senses.
Bingo.
Because it can be in the same dimension with us. Our band of stuff that we pick up with our senses is so narrow.
I think that's an incredibly important point, especially as we're coming into the last minutes of this interview. Here we are in these fairly fragile bodies. We see out of these two eyes in in the three-dimensional world. A dog can hear much better than us. You put us in a situation that's a few degrees too hot, too cold, we perish. Our brain does what it does, processes information in a way that isn't fully utilized, and we call this reality and perception. It's a little arrogant, but we human beings are famous for that, aren't we?
Nice. All right. Well, thank you, and we're going to have to do this again.
I look forward to it, Soraya. Great having you here.
Thanks, Peter.